At 20 years old, she was effectively without a roof over her head. Her uncle had sent her off with $75 and a curt final remark that resembled closing out an account rather than bidding farewell. With no family left to rely on, no distinct intentions, and only one possession that carried true significance, she felt the heavy, cool brass of her father's pocket compass pressing into her palm. She took $70 from that settlement and purchased a broken-down steamship, the Starlight Queen, left stranded in the scorched, sun-whitened basin of Saltwash, a town located 50 miles away from any body of water fit for navigation. Yet no one in Saltwash knew, and the land agent who had unloaded the vessel for unpaid taxes had long since neglected to remember that hidden inside the captain's quarters was a secret with the power to alter not just her destiny, but also the prospects of that neglected community. Make yourself comfortable and tell us where you're joining from as we bring you the story of Mabel Thornton and the ship that became her entire world. Mabel's life was molded by two opposing forces, steam and ink, stemming from her father, Thomas Thornton, an engineer on riverboats. He was someone who communicated effortlessly in the language of boilers and pistons, his hands permanently marked by grease. His soul was filled with the untethered freedom that comes from life on the river. He carried the odor of molten metal and coal smoke. He was the one who taught Mabel to appreciate a snugly fitted gasket and the fine margins required for a gleaming brass fixture. In his mind, the world was an exquisitely engineered creation, and comprehending its workings was a kind of worship. She was only 12 when he lost his life in a boiler blast, but before that, he had placed the compass in her hands. "So you never lose your bearings," he'd said in his deep, rumbling voice. Her mother had already passed away years earlier, slowly fading from consumption. Even around the river's bends, that guidance stayed with her. All Mabel had left to remember her mother by was a faint scent of lavender and the memory of a gentle hand on her forehead. Once her father died, she was packed off to live with his only surviving relative, his older brother Silas. Silas Thornton was a creature of ledgers and paperwork, a merchant operating in a small but affluent town. He regarded the world as nothing more than a book of losses and gains, and cold arithmetic was, in his view, the sole virtue deserving of respect. He took Mabel in, but not out of affection. It was an obligation he resented. He considered himself indebted to the family name. To him, she was an entry on his balance sheet, an expenditure to be minimized, so he put her to work in his store. Her modest efficiency contrasted sharply with the showy arrogance of her cousins. She handled sweeping, restocking, and gradually Silas realized that her keen mind and steady hand were tailor-made for his bookkeeping. She picked up the vocabulary of his trade receivables, inventory, cost of goods sold, but she never spoke her father's language in the past tense. Evenings found her absorbed in the engineering diagrams he had left behind, elaborate sketches of steam engines and paddle wheel assemblies. Her uncle viewed her as nothing more than a dependent, yet her father had seen her as a partner, a mind every bit as inquisitive and skilled as his own. Never once did she leave the house without his compass tucked into her apron, its weight serving as a constant tether. It was a link to a realm where true worth was based on workmanship, not on currency. What mattered was the graceful, formidable logic of a machine constructed to control the river's current. This subtle schooling in both mechanical matters and commercial dealings sharpened her powers of observation, her patience, and her deep-rooted independence, attributes her uncle never saw and certainly did not treasure. All he perceived was a quiet girl who represented a drain on his finances. It never crossed his mind that he was sheltering the single person who genuinely grasped the very bedrock of the prosperity he enjoyed. Her departure from Silas Thornton's household came as understatedly as everything else in her time there. It was not an angry confrontation or a theatrical scene, but simply a cold institutional choice delivered to her across the glossy surface of his oak desk. His eldest son, Walter, was engaged to marry a woman from a family of respectable rank. Some space had to be freed up for the new daughter-in-law, both in the home and within the operations of the business. By the unfeeling arithmetic of her uncle's universe, Mabel had become an unnecessary extra. One Tuesday morning, he summoned her to his office, where the environment was saturated with the aroma of old leather and dusty paper. He didn't offer her a chair. He simply stood behind his desk, hands locked behind his back. His gaze wasn't on her, but on a spot on the wall just past her shoulder. "Mabel," he began, his tone completely flat. "Walter is getting married next month. His wife, Eleanor, will take over the household finances and help at the shop. Your room will be needed for them." He paused, letting the news echo in the quiet space. "I've decided your services are no longer needed." He pushed a slim, flat envelope across the desk. "This holds $75, a final settlement for all your years of work. In my view, that's a generous sum." This wasn't a negotiation, but a verdict. Mabel looked at the envelope, then at his unreadable face. She found no cruelty there, but also no kindness, not a single trace of their old connection. She was just an item being struck from the records. She'd always known this day would come in some form. She had lived on borrowed time there, a guest in a house that never felt like home. She didn't plead or object. That would have revealed a weakness he wouldn't understand or respect. All she did was nod once. "I understand," she said, her voice as steady as his. She took the envelope and climbed to the small attic room that had been hers for 8 years. Into a single carpet bag, she packed her few possessions: 2 faded dresses, a spare set of undergarments, and her father's rolled-up diagrams tied with twine. She also had a little pouch of tools she'd slowly gathered. She left the quilt on the bed and the book on the nightstand. Those belonged to the house, not to her. As she went down the stairs, she stopped to glance at the family portraits on the wall. Her father wasn't in any of them. It felt as though he, and therefore she, had never truly been part of that household. She closed the front door silently behind her. In her pocket, the compass pressed against her leg, a solid and comforting weight. The journey had begun. The stagecoach trip west was a real test of grit, filled with dust. Mabel sat by the window and watched the familiar green hills of her uncle's valley shift into rolling plains, finally bleaching into the dry, cracked terrain of the Great Basin. The world outside became a blend of beige and ochre, dominated by an enormous, uncaring sky. Abrasive dust seeped through the window seams, covering her dress, her hands, and even her lashes with grit. It found its way down her throat, so she rationed her water with small, careful sips. The other travelers were all strangers, a group of exhausted miners, one stern-looking woman, and her 2 young children. As the miles dragged on, each person sank further into their own quiet misery. Mabel stayed in her own focused bubble, eyes locked on the horizon. She didn't think about what she'd left behind. You can't lose something you never really had. Instead, she thought about what awaited at a dusty way station, where she'd spotted a handbill for land parcels in a place called Saltwash. That place had been founded on the banks of a river that, thanks to a strange quirk of geology, had dried up 20 years earlier, leaving the town high and dry. The handbill mentioned unclaimed lots going for the price of unpaid back taxes. The name stayed with her, a town summed up by being forsaken. After 3 days of travel, that felt right. The coach climbed a low rise, and the driver announced that Saltwash lay below, nestled in a broad, glittering salt flat. The town looked exactly as she'd pictured. A few sun-beaten wooden buildings clustered together for comfort against the vast emptiness. The streets were wide and silent, and a fine white powder rose with each gust of wind, leaving a taste of salt and alkali in the air. But what truly startled her, making her sit up straight, was the ship at the edge of town. A fully intact paddle-wheel steamer sat on a dry bank above the long-gone riverbed. It stood as a memorial to a promise that never came true, its white paint peeling, its 2 smokestacks cutting sharply into the sky. It was foolish, magnificent, and completely forsaken. The stagecoach stopped in front of a building marked with a weathered sign, Saltwash Land Office. Mabel grabbed her bag, gave the driver the last of her money, and stepped out into the blazing sunlight. The air was hot and still as she moved toward the office, certain of her path. The ship struck a chord deep inside her, a strange fragment of her father's life stranded amid her uncle's world. It was a damaged object, a forgotten line in the books, a machine with no purpose. And with a touch of dark amusement, she thought it was exactly like her. The land office was nothing more than a solitary, dusty room run by a man called Alistair Abernathy. A tired-looking clerk wearing a green eyeshade and ink-stained cuffs glanced up from his files as Mabel stepped inside. A brief look of astonishment crossed his face when he saw a young woman arriving on her own. "Need help?" he asked, his tone as arid as the desert outside. "I'm looking into the unclaimed holdings," Mabel stated firmly, the steamship in particular. Abernathy sat back in his chair, a slow, skeptical smile forming. "The Starlight Queen, dear? That isn't property, it's a local landmark, a tribute to terrible decisions." He laughed quietly. The Saltwash Folly River dried up in '68, leaving her stranded exactly where she rests today. She's been sitting there for 20 years. Mabel returned his stare without a hint of hesitation. "Does it have a deed? Can it be bought?" Her straightforward manner seemed to unsettle him. He began searching through a large wooden box filled with fragile paperwork. "Let's see. Ah, there she is, Starlight Queen, belonging to the dissolved Saltwash Steam Navigation Company. The property became the county's due to 19 years of back taxes." He peered at the register. "The full amount owed, including charges and interest, is $70. He turned his gaze to her with a cunning look. "Do you have $70? Mabel set the cash taken from her uncle's envelope onto the table. 7 pristine $10 bills. Abernathy looked at the money, then at her, then back at the money again. He gave a shrug. "Well, I'll be damned, it's your money." He filled out the deed transfer using a scratchy pen, taking his time with each stroke. He blotted the ink, pressed a heavy seal onto the page, and slid the document across the desk. "She's entirely yours, Miss Hull Boilers, paddle wheel, and every bit of dust and vermin inside. Wishing you the best." Mabel folded the title and stashed it in her bag. Leaving the office, she walked in the direction of the ship, now the legitimate owner of the biggest, most useless object in all the basin. As she got nearer, she could see just how massive it was. The side of the vessel towered about 30 feet up from the earth, its planks bleached gray and split like old bones. The name Starlight Queen remained visible in worn-out gold paint. At the front, she spotted the gangplank, surprisingly still whole, and made her way onto the main deck. The wood groaned beneath her, and a heavy coat of dust covered everything like a thick carpet. On the upper deck, she looked through the grimy windows of the grand salon, making out the remnants of velvet-covered chairs and brass lamps. She then went to the back, where the engine room entry was. The hatch resisted, but she managed to force it open and climbed down the iron ladder into the core of the vessel. Encircled by the silent, enormous twin boilers and the massive, unmoving piston arms, she felt the first real glimmer of hope inside her. The machinery lay under dust and webs, yet it was structurally intact. The iron was rough but not rusted all the way through, and the brass fixtures were dull yet strong. This was a language she knew intimately. It was the world of her father. This was no mistake, it was a stronghold, a home just waiting to be revived. The first week aboard the Starlight Queen was a struggle against 20 years of neglect. Mabel's first goal was merely to carve out a small livable spot within the huge ship. She settled on a compact steward's cabin on the main deck, which had an east-facing window for morning sunlight. The door was attached by only one hinge, and there was no glass in the window, but it was a space she could make her own. Her schedule settled into a pattern of constant, disciplined labor. The first 2 days went entirely to sweeping, clearing away enormous piles of dust, grime, and the dried-up remains of creatures long gone. She located a piece of canvas in a storage locker and used it to cover the window, making a semi-transparent covering that allowed light in while keeping out the harshest wind. With some wire and a nail, she mended the door hinge, making her tiny toolkit extremely valuable. The most urgent need was water. The town's well was about a quarter-mile away. She made that trip 2 times a day, hauling 2 sizable buckets that she had discovered in the ship's galley. The walk back was a slow, cautious shuffle to prevent losing even one valuable drop. She became adept at conserving it, reserving one portion for drinking and cooking and reusing the dirty water to wash the floors. She discovered a small pot-bellied stove in the galley, and its flue pipe had corroded through in various spots. She devoted an entire day to carefully taking it apart, cleaning every piece, and using tin strips cut from an old crate to patch the pipe that evening. For the first time, she started a small blaze. The aroma of burning mosquito bathed her tiny cabin in a warm, comforting radiance. It was a major triumph. A little slice of civilization formed out of the decay. Still, her mind kept wandering back to the captain's cabin. At the front of the upper deck, within the pilot house, it sat, offering an unobstructed view over the dry riverbed. The door was built from solid oak and locked securely, its brass keyhole dark and impossible to see through. None of the skeleton keys she discovered on a ring in the galley would turn the lock. Inspecting the hinges, she found them robust and bolted from the inside, making any simple entry impossible. Her curiosity was powerful, but it ran even deeper. That cabin acted as the ship's nerve center, its core. Having it sealed off felt wrong and deeply unsettled her. On a purely practical note, it was the ship's most fortified and secure compartment. One afternoon, after making her own quarters safe, she made up her mind to get in one way or another. She hauled her tools up to the top deck. Her first approach involved a thin wire and a small tension wrench she'd crafted from a nail to pick the lock. She had once watched her father use this same technique on a stubborn toolbox. She toiled patiently for over an hour, detecting faint clicks from the pins, but rust and age had seized the mechanism. The lock would not give in. Frustrated but undeterred, she changed tactics. Instead of breaking the door, she would take it apart, beginning with removing the lock itself. 2 big screws anchored the lock assembly in place. Their grooves were so full of grime and corrosion that she spent a full 10 minutes patiently scraping them clean with her largest screwdriver. Then, putting all her weight into it and turning with slow, steady force, the metal screeched in protest. The first screw turned a little, then a bit more. After nearly an hour of exhausting effort that left her knuckles scraped raw, both screws finally came out. With a final solid thud, she worked the brass lock free from its mortise. Once it came loose, the door swung inward with a low, mournful groan, allowing light into the room for the first time in 20 years. The air rushing from the captain's cabin was musty and parched, filled with the smell of old paper and sun-heated wood. A fine, pale layer of dust covered every surface, preserving the room like a perfect snapshot of its final moments of use. Against the far wall stood a sturdy oak desk with a captain's chair placed in front of it. Lying open on the desk was a heavy logbook bound in dark leather. Beside it sat a brass oil lamp, its glass chimney remarkably still whole. To the left was a narrow cot with a blanket folded in military neatness, and to the right stood a large, iron-banded sea chest. Mabel stepped within, her boots leaving soft prints in the dust. She passed her hand across the desk, feeling the wood smooth and cool beneath the grime. She went over to the logbook and lightly wiped the dust from its pages. The ink was faded but still readable, set down in a strong, steady hand. The entries recounted the final, hopeless weeks of the Starlight Queen's life on the river. The 10th of May, 1868. Water level dropped another 4 inches. Ran aground twice today. Had to use the winch to pull her off the sandbar. The river is slowly perishing. The last entry was dated the 1st of June, 1868. Tied her up at the saltwash landing for the final time. The company has broken apart. All the passengers have departed. I am the only one left. The river is gone. May God help us. The name signed was Captain Elias Vance. Mabel felt a curious bond with this long-lost captain, another person left behind by a world that had moved on without him. She began tidying the cabin, not with the frantic urgency of her first days, but with a serene sense of respect. While wiping down the heavy oak desk, she noticed something unusual about how it was put together. It was a plain, practical piece, yet the front panel beneath the main drawer seemed crafted from a different wood grain. The discrepancy was so slight that only a keen eye would catch it. She traced the edge with her fingers, finding no handle, no seam. She pressed on it, first lightly, then with greater effort nothing happened. She checked the 3 drawers, all of which she had already opened and found empty, but their depth didn't seem to correspond to the desk's overall depth. There was a hollow space, a hidden compartment. She went back to the front panel and started tapping it gently, paying attention to the sound. For the most part, it gave off a dull thud, but toward the right the noise was a little more hollow. She applied firm pressure there. There was a subtle click, and the tension gave way. A piece of the panel, about the size of a book, pivoted inward on a concealed hinge. Within the dark recess lay a compact, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and a tidy stack of bills bound by a leather band. Her heart thudded wildly. She picked up the cash with shaking hands. It consisted of both federal notes and gold certificates. She counted it slowly while moving her lips soundlessly. The total was $3,000, a small fortune, far more than she had ever dreamed of seeing at once. Underneath was the oilcloth bundle. She undid the string and rolled it open. Contained within was a letter whose paper had yellowed but remained in perfect shape, along with a tiny item. It was a small bird whittled from one chunk of driftwood, its wings halfway open as if caught in flight. She lifted the letter. The same bold, neat handwriting that had completed the logbook had addressed it simply to whoever finds this. She settled into the captain's dusty seat and started reading. The writing of Captain Elias Vance filled the quiet cabin, a voice spanning 20 years of quietness. If you are reading this, that means you have discovered my final port. You probably have also come upon my ship, a tribute to a river that lost its own route. I am Elias Vance. I captained her for 10 years. I write these words not from hopelessness, but from a small glimmer of hope. Mabel kept reading, her breath caught tightly in her chest. The company went broke when the water vanished. They gave me the small amount they had and handed the ship over to me as my ending severance. My plan was to sell her for parts and move my family westward to the coast, yet no one wanted to buy. Nobody wanted a steamboat in the middle of what had become a desert. My wife, Sarah, and our little girl Lily stayed with me in Saltwash. We waited for the spring melt, hoping it would lift the water level enough to sail the Queen downriver. However, that thaw never arrived. Instead, that winter a fever swept through the town and claimed both of them just 7 days apart. Lily had just turned 6. Mabel paused in her reading, running her fingers over the bird's smooth surface. It was a toy for a child tiny and uncomplicated, yet carrying an immense load of affection and grief. Once they were gone, she went on with the letter. There was nothing left for me in the West. This vessel was the final tie to the existence I once had, so I remained. I took on small jobs around town, but made my home on the Queen. I looked after her as thoroughly as possible. The cash you've come across is every single dollar I ever saved. It represents my pay from 10 years spent on the water plus the modest income I made during my stay here. It's not a princely fortune, but it's a starting stake. It's sufficient to begin something new. With no family to pass it on to, I'm giving it to you, whoever you may be. I pass it along to someone who has the patience and foresight to see worth in what others have cast off. Put it to good use. Maybe you can bring this place back to life, or maybe it will serve as your ticket to a better place. The choice is entirely yours. My only request is that you recall that a man called Elias Vance deeply loved his family and this ship. The note ended with a simple signature: Captain Vance. Mabel folded the letter gently and tucked it back into its oilcloth cover. She glanced about the cabin, the desk, the bunk, the logbook. This was no longer merely an unoccupied space. It was a responsibility. The $3,000 was not some discovered booty. It was an inheritance entrusted to her. She picked up the carved bird, clutched it in one hand, and pulled her father's brass compass out of her pocket. She held that in the other hand. The compass pointed her through the world, while the bird reminded her what turned a location into a home. She wasn't going to abandon Saltwash. Captain Vance had provided her with a start, and she intended to do justice to his faith. She would restore this place. The Starlight Queen was destined for a fresh mission. The captain's legacy transformed everything. It wasn't merely cash. It was opportunity, a way to convert staying alive into a future. For the following 2 days, Mabel did nothing except make plans. She was seated at Captain Vance's desk, equipped with paper and pencil, drafting, computing, and pondering. Her plan wasn't merely to reside in the vessel, it was to completely reimagine it. Despite its barren appearance, Saltwash sat at a junction where miners, land surveyors, and merchants frequently traveled. Yet no proper lodging existed for these visitors, just a noisy tavern with a handful of dirty rooms overhead. The Starlight Queen was destined to be reborn as the Starlight Inn, a spotless and secure place to stay. The massive engine hall, featuring lofty ceilings and solid iron bases, was set to serve as her workspace. There, she would fix wagons, tools, and any equipment that came her way. The undertaking was bold and demanded tremendous effort. After safely stowing the captain's funds, she headed into town to gather provisions. From the town's modest, barely operating sawmill, she purchased timber. From the general store, glass panes and nails. She also acquired screws, paint, and multiple gallons of linseed oil. The locals observed her with silent fascination. What began as amusement at the girl who'd purchased the folly slowly shifted to reluctant admiration. Witnessing the enormous quantity of supplies she transported to the ship, trip after trip in a rented wagon, they grew impressed. Her initial significant undertaking was fully waterproofing the boat. Beginning on the top deck, she carefully swapped out every shattered pane of glass. With care, she removed the brittle old putty and installed new glass using fresh glazing pins. The process was painstaking and required precision. Next, she focused on the deck. Its boards, faded and warped from sun exposure, had gaps that allowed breezes and dust to pass through. After purchasing barrels of pine tar, she devoted a full week, kneeling on the ground, to painstakingly sealing each crack with oakum and hot, sticky tar, the exact method her father had shown her for waterproofing the sailors' vessels. Though exhausting, the labor brought the ship greater strength and completeness with every sealed gap. It was in the midst of this endeavor that she first genuinely engaged with a resident of the town. One afternoon, a nearly retired carpenter from the town, Jedediah Croft, came by. He stood with his hands resting in the front pocket of his overalls, observing her intently for an extended period. A frown creased his forehead. "You're employing marine-grade caulking," he eventually remarked in a deep, raspy tone. "Yes, I am," Mabel answered without pausing her labor. "This vessel was built as a ship, so I'm honoring that." A gradual smile spread across his aged, sun-beaten features. "She certainly does." He gestured using his chin, indicating a sagging portion of the railing and noting that a post had decayed at its bottom. "You should reinforce that before it bears any load." The following morning, he came back carrying a sturdy oak board and his personal tools. "Thought you might find this handy," he offered. He then demonstrated the technique for fashioning a mortise and tenon connection to anchor the new post, something she had no idea how to do. He requested no compensation. He set the precedent. Several days afterward, Martha Paisley, the baker's wife, a plump woman with gentle eyes, walked up the boarding plank holding a covered basket. "I've noticed your light stays on late each night," she said in a friendly tone. "No one can survive on pure labor alone." Within the basket rested a loaf of freshly baked bread, a pot of butter, and a generous slab of apple pie. After that, Martha visited twice weekly, consistently bringing something from her oven. Her visits were brief, but her consistent, understated kindness eased Mabel's loneliness. The final component became clear when she started on the engine room. For the huge cargo door, she needed to craft a new hinge, a piece of metalwork that demanded a forge. She visited Samuel Finch, a young blacksmith with strong arms and a solemn expression, carrying one of her father's vintage blueprints to clarify the exact specifications. He examined the plan, his trained gaze appreciating the crisp rendering and precise dimensions. "Your father was an engineer," he declared, without a hint of doubt. "Indeed he was," Mabel confirmed. Samuel nodded in response. "I'm able to forge this, yet it'd be preferable if you assisted. For the following 2 days, you'll understand its function." She labored beside him at the anvil, absorbing the cadence of the hammer, the scent of heated metal, and the precise timing for tempering the steel. He billed her solely for the raw iron. Through these continuous, modest gestures of assistance, a sense of community gradually developed around her. These weren't traditional friendships. There were no exchange tales or confidences. Rather, they connected over the labor they perceived in her, the same hard-working, independent ethos they admired in themselves. They recognized that she wasn't merely restoring a vessel, she was constructing an entire existence. In their unobtrusive manner, they provided her the means to accomplish it. A year passed, and the Starlight Queen came back to life. Her fresh white paint shone brightly under the desert sun, with navy blue trim adding a sharp contrast. The lettering on her bow had been re-gilded, a brilliant gold accent against the barren scenery. 4 of the former cabins on the main deck were transformed into neat, basic, cozy guest rooms. Everyone featured a newly paned window, a solid bed, and a compact wood-burning stove. The main saloon, now with tough canvas and varnished wood in place of worn-out velvet, had become a communal lounge and eating area. Down below, the engine room saw a similar overhaul. The once idle machines, having been greased and cleaned, looked like impressive silent works of art in iron and brass. The remaining area was set up as a practical workshop, fitted with workbenches, implements, and a small forge that Samuel Finch assisted her in constructing. She opened the Starlight Inn and Repair for Trade, with Mabel Thornton as its proprietor. Her reputation spread across the entire basin, and soon she was known as Miss Mabel, the innkeeper. The initial visitor to her establishment was a geologist from the State Survey, who remained for a month and compensated her with gold. A traveling judge, 2 trappers, and a westbound family in need of wagon axle repair came after him. They were drawn by the tidy accommodations, the wholesome meals she prepared in the galley's small kitchen, and her increasingly recognized talent as a mechanic. She found a pleasant new daily pattern, waking up before dawn. As daybreak caught her in the galley, she would light the huge cooking stove. The aroma of coffee and bacon would waft over the still sleeping town, announcing the start of a new day. Old carpenter Jedediah Croft began appearing each morning to join her over coffee in the saloon. While they observed, the morning sun colored the salt flats with hues of pink and orange. Martha Paisley provided all the inn's bread and baked goods. In return, they offered lodging to her visiting cousin for a month of baking. Samuel Finch would come to Mabel's workshop whenever he needed to handle bigger jobs that were too large for his own forge. The vessel had stopped being a laughingstock. It had become the calm yet lively hub of the town's business and social interactions. It served as a spot for relaxation, maintenance, and gathering, so much so that local kids occasionally played on the lower deck. Mabel allowed this, taking the opportunity to explain how the massive paddle wheel pistons functioned. She shared tales with them about the river that had once flowed there. No longer was she the rejected outsider, simply holding $75. Instead, she had become a permanent presence, an esteemed entrepreneur, and an integral thread in the community of Saltwash. Saltwash, which had previously been characterized by its losses, was gradually taking on a new identity shaped by the things constructed to fill that void. At last, the Starlight Queen had discovered her true and most significant home. On a late autumn night, with the desert air turning chilly and the sky darkening to a deep, bruised shade of purple, Mabel took her place on the captain's walk. From just outside the pilot house, she surveyed the entire township of Saltwash below. Warm, welcoming light spilled from the windows of the little homes and the general store, standing out against the enormous darkness of the basin. Her inn's lamps created a friendly patch of illumination on the ground below, where a traveler's wagon sat parked overnight. A slender wisp of smoke climbed from the saloon's chimney, and the distant notes of a piano reached her ears. Though the town was peaceful, it was unmistakably full of life. Nearly 2 years had passed since her arrival. She stepped back indoors to the captain's cabin now, her personal office and lounge. The little stove glowed with a crackling fire, softening the light upon the desk's polished surface. Taking a seat in Captain Vance's chair, she felt the wood that had been polished to smoothness by countless years of handling. 2 items rested together on the desk's corner: her father's brass compass, which still had its needle faithfully pointing north, and Captain Vance's hand-carved wooden bird, its wings permanently set to take off. Her mind turned to the 2 men she had never gotten the chance to bid a fitting farewell. One was her father, Thomas Thornton, who equipped her with the knowledge to comprehend life and a tool to help her navigate it. There was also Captain Elias Vance, whom she had never encountered face to face, a stranger connected to her through mutual grief and a shared affection for a beached vessel. He had not only given her a financial investment, more importantly, he had handed her a mission, a heritage to preserve. For just an instant, her Uncle Silas crossed her mind. There was no anger or bitterness within her, just a faint sadness for a man whose world was so narrow. Numbers were the only measure he knew. He had paid her off with $75, thinking that would remove her from his existence forever. He never could have guessed the scale of what that meager amount would come to construct. His sense of worth extended only to things that had a price, and so he tossed aside both a woman and a location he considered of no account. Yet from those two rejected elements, she created this entire universe. At the age of 20, Mabel Thornton came to Salt Wash, carrying next to nothing. $70 went toward an abandoned steamboat located 50 miles from any shoreline. That turned out to be the smartest $70 she'd ever used. It gave her not only a place to live, but an entire existence. Should you have been touched by Mabel's tale about discovering a home in an improbable spot, think about subscribing to hear further stories of perseverance and exploration. Our conviction is that worth exists even in the most neglected spaces, and that resilience resides within the unlikeliest souls. To close, here's a question to take with you through the days ahead. Is there some overlooked item, either in your personal world or in your neighborhood, that could contain untapped worth, simply awaiting a fresh glance? Share your thoughts in the comment section. We appreciate you joining us.